Good evening, welcome to everybody, welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight we're continuing on with our series of Journeys of Faith. We are in lesson number 75, and tonight's lesson is called Daniel's Greek Goat Nibbles the Persian Ram. And so it's a bit of a funny or a cheeky title, but it's actually a play on the vision of Daniel when the shaggy goat, who is representative of Alexander the Great, obviously a Greek, or actually more correctly a Macedonian ruler, will come and he will knock out the Persians, fulfilling the Lord's word. So last week we were looking at the story of Esther and Mordecai, and in last week's story we got up to the part where Haman was found out and he was hung on the gallows in front of his family for all to see, because he tried to stop the Jewish people from having any power. He wanted to decimate them, and he was an Agagite, which was anyone remember? Haman the Agagite is a descendant of the Amalekites, and the Amalekites are the traditional enemies of the Jews or the Israelites because
during the Exodus.
Right, so in the first instance, and it happened more times in history, but in the first instance, they actually attacked the tail of the Israelites as they were wandering through the desert, and there was no provocation, there was no reason for it. They simply attacked them. Perhaps they thought they would get something from them, and as a consequence of that, they've been their traditional enemy throughout history. And so Haman was actually a descendant of the Agagites, and Agag was actually a name of a Amalekite king, and so that's where the connection is. So picking up today, we're just going to start with the background as we usually do, just to give you some context. So we're following the genealogy of Jesus. We're currently reading through the point of time, the events that happened during the life of Abiad. Last week we had a look at some of the scriptures from Esther, and we established that Abiad was alive at exactly the same time as Mordecai and Esther. And this week we're also going to see that Abiad's the father of Eliakim, and so both of these descendants, we're going to finish off Abiad tonight, and we're also going to look at Eliakim, who has a shorter story historically in the Bible. Now, during the reign of these people, so here's Abiad up on this chart in the lime green, and Eliakim in this yellow colour underneath. And so when we track along, we find that there's several changes of rulers during the life of Abiad from the Persian Empire, and we also find that several changes of rulers during the life of Eliakim. So tonight we're starting off here with Xerxes the first, who we established who he was last week. And we're actually going to go through 6 different rulers. Some of them don't get to rule for very long. In fact, it's a matter of weeks or days or months. But we're going to explain the journey of what happens there. Again, continuing with the background, this is what the Jewish nation looks like in this period of history. So it's known as the province of Judea, or Yehud Medinata, as it was called in Persian. And this means the Jewish people who live by the Mediterranean. And so you can see the size of the area that they occupy at this point in time. And then the Persian Empire, it's at its greatest size. And so the yellow area on this map represents all of the current Persian Empire. And there's a couple of markings on here, because we're starting off with Xerxes. This is a carved relief of what he looked like. We find out that Ecbatana in today's Iran is actually the former capital of the Median Empire. Is actually the place where Esther and Mordecai are buried. And tonight I'm actually going to show you a picture of their actual tomb, which still exists to this day. Susa, this is the operating capital city in which Esther and Mordecai are at. And so we found there in 479 BC that King Xerxes married Esther to become queen of the Persian Empire, and her actions, and that of Mordecai of course, stopped the Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire from being exterminated by genocide in 474 BC. So we're going to finish off that part of the story tonight. Now, the other capitals for the Persian Empire is this place called Pasargadae, and in this place the coronations of the new kings would take place, and so that name's going to come up tonight. And Persepolis is a place where they'd celebrate national holidays at the ceremonial palace, so that all the ceremonies happen here. And in fact, if there's executions of people, which happens in tonight's story, they take them to Persepolis to also execute them there. So this is that place. And so Babylon was another place where they also had a palace to rule from. And so depending on the season and what's going on, all these locations were various places. So they used to move between capitals for the weather as well. So in winter and summer and spring, they would move between different palaces into the warmer or cooler air accordingly. So it's just a bit of background. But tonight, we're going to start off by having a look at this scripture. I'll just come back to this in one moment. On the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, in the winter of 474 BC, the Jews went out, the Bible tells us, and they struck down their enemies throughout the Persian Empire. So if you open your Bibles to Esther chapter 9, verses 3 to 4. So that's Esther chapter 9, verses 3 to 4. And it reads, "And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps," which of course are the kings or the governors and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces and he became more and more powerful. And so that comes on the back of what happened last week when he uncovered what was going on with the governor who was going to exterminate his people. And it was actually his actions that began the process that ended up protecting the Jewish people. And so up on the board here tonight, a picture which I've put up on numerous occasions, this sin cycle as I call it. This is the story of life, or the story of the Bible, or the story of sin. And basically the way it works is when we read the Bible, New or Old Testament, mankind sins. And so when mankind sins, God punishes. We read this right throughout the Bible. When people repent, God rescues them and he restores them back into relationship with him. Unfortunately, when we read the Old Testament, this is like a wagon wheel that goes around and around and around. When we get to the New Testament, the way that this works is that it is us who sin, but who took the punishment?
Jesus.
It was Jesus who took the punishment. Right? By him taking the punishment, he rescued us from the enemy and restored us back into relationship with God. It's a very simple way of looking at the story of the Bible. And so the story of the Bible, as we're reading it, we're following the generations through the genealogy of Jesus, is, as I call in this book, it's a journey to faith. That's what it is. Everybody's on a journey, and they're on a journey to faith, because at the end of the day, after we've read the whole of the Old Testament, Jesus had to come, the Messiah had to come. And for the Jewish people today who don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, they of course are still waiting for the Messiah to come. So the story is still the same. So in this journey that we're looking at currently with Mordecai, his faith led to his younger cousin Hadassah, who was also named Esther, to marry Persia's King Xerxes I, who we looked at last week in Susa. Mordecai rescued his people who lived throughout the Persian Empire from being annihilated by Haman, who I've just mentioned, a descendant of a past Amalekite king who was spared by Israel's first king, Saul. And so that's the period of time that that king came from. So I have a question for you tonight, and it is, what do Joseph, Daniel and Mordecai have in common? So they like to have a beer together, was it?
Cupbearers.
They're cupbearers. Were they all cupbearers?
Oh, second in command.
Joseph.
Second in command, they were,
If God placed him
right?
under non-God-fearing kings
Yes.
to take care of his people.
Yes, that's correct, and it's all correct. So, anything else to add? So we've got Joseph, Daniel, and Mordecai. They represent 3 periods of biblical history which are hugely significant even to today. If I lived in Israel today, there are celebrations that are connected to each of these different people. Okay. So who was Joseph? Joseph was the son of Jacob, and he was taken and he was put into slavery in Egypt, wasn't he? And then he rose to become the king of Egypt, in essence. He wasn't the pharaoh, but he was the number 1 governor or ruler. And so in ancient times, governors or rulers were called kings as well. And so Daniel was during the time of the Babylonian exile with Nebuchadnezzar. And what happened to Daniel? He was put in charge of the kingdom of Babylon. Not the whole Babylonian empire, but the kingdom of Babylon. So he was the ruler and the governor. So God's placing these people into significant positions because of what's happening to his people. Mordecai, he's here during the time of the Persian Empire. So he's placed in a significant position beside the king. He gets his own cousin to marry the king, and he manages to save the whole of the Jewish population. So what do they all have in common? Joseph, Daniel, and Mordecai all got to save God's people. And so if we have a look at... Oops. What am I doing? What have I done wrong here? Sorry, I'm just having a moment here. There we go. And so, excuse me, let's have a bit of fun up here. And so as I've written here, as with Joseph in Egypt and Daniel in Babylon, God always places a righteous person in a significant position to rescue, protect, and restore his people. So there's the functions. To rescue, protect, and restore his people. So if you had a look at the world today, or your life today, you might think of somebody that's been placed in a significant position to do exactly the same. Maybe on a smaller scale, maybe on a bigger scale. So Joseph, Daniel, and Mordecai, and this is one of the things they had in common, they were all personally threatened and they all risked death. Mordecai was going to be hung on a gallows. Daniel was put into a pit with lions. Joseph, he was put into prison. Right? All of them had their lives threatened. Remember, the wife of the captain of the guard of the prison wanted to see him executed because he didn't do what she wanted. And so we see here that they all risked death. Why did they risk it? Because of their faith. They were willing to risk death. And so God's plan for each of them saw them prosper, however, in that situation and placed into significant positions of power under, as you mentioned, Dennis, earthly rulers who sought to annihilate his people. And so it's a very powerful story where we see this repetition. God's people sinned in every single instance. And then they were rescued. God put people into significant places in order to protect them until they repented, they rescued, they did their time of punishment, and then they were blessed and prospered and restored back into relationship with God again. This is the overriding story of the Bible. When we repent, God will prosper us. He will bless us. And so when we get to the end of the book of Esther, it gives us the detailed information, I guess, for Mordecai, because this is what happens. Remember the scripture that we just read? It said that he grew and grew in esteem in the kingdom. And here in Esther 10 verse 3 it says, Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes. So we find because he stood up for his people, he ended up being blessed. He was prosperous because When Esther had Haman identified, Haman's estate was given to her and she gave it to Mordecai to manage the estate. And so they were blessed with great wealth. It goes on to say, preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. And so each and every person here was prepared to make a sacrifice, a personal sacrifice, for the good of God's people. And so we must understand that these are significant periods of time in which God brings his people back home again, and his hand is always in the locations where they have been dispersed to during the time of punishment, which tells us that God is a good father because he's going to punish you for what you've done wrong, but he doesn't abandon you. He wants you to change and come back into relationship again. And this is the big overlooking or overarching story that we find in the Old Testament of the Bible. And so carrying on from there, the month of Adar in the Hebrew or the Jewish calendar had always been a low point, because this was the month that they remembered the death of Moses, who led their people out of Egyptian captivity. Now the lot or the pur, which I mentioned last week, does anyone remember? So a pur is the Persian word for lot, and so they would choose lots. In other words, it's a system by which there's no favouritism. Cast by Haman and his diviners, couldn't have fallen at a worse time, for they too were given this date for the collective death of all God's chosen people. So as we often see in the Bible, we see repetition of like dates and events happening throughout periods of history. So when the 13th day of Adar came around, not only were their lives spared, but they were legally, and this is the point, they were legally given permission by the king of the Persian Empire to strike down their enemy. The Holy Bible says in Esther chapter 9 verse 22 that their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. And so the permission that was given to them was a scripture which we had a look at last week. So I'm not going to reread it, but they were given permission to strike down those who would come against them. And so the king of the day says, I'm going to give you permission to go ahead and do that. So the Jews in Susa assembled on the 13th day of Adar, and the Bible tells us that they struck down 500 men. In Esther chapter 9 verse 8, it says, they also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, going pretty well here, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman. And so in other words, those who as a race of people would come against the Jewish people, they removed the descendants so that they couldn't come against them again. And so we see this event taking place. After this was done, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther a further opportunity to petition him with any other request she may have, and she asked him to extend the edict to the 14th of Adar, and also have the bodies of Haman's son hung for all to see. This was granted, and another 300 men were killed. So we hear a lot about people who are being held to account for what they were going to do. So throughout the empire, we find out, in fact, that 75,000 Jewish enemies were killed on the 13th of Adar. And so there's a considerable number of people who were very happy to stop the Jewish people from existing on this earth. And although the Jews had been given permission to plunder their enemies' property, they refrained. This was a day to punish those who persecuted God's people, not a day to gain worldly possessions. And so this set them apart. Now, because the Jews in Susa assembled on both the 13th and 14th of Adar, they rested and feasted in joy on the 15th, but the Jews throughout the rest of the empire rested and celebrated on the 14th, different calendar system. Mordecai recorded these events, and in conjunction with Queen Esther, a letter was sent out to all Jews throughout the Persian Empire to establish and celebrate those days as an annual festival called Purim, for all future generations. And as I've mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this was just celebrated in Israel and by the Jewish people around the world. And so it still happens to this day. So this actually brings us now to the chronological end of the books from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament of the Christian Bible as we know it. The story of Mordecai and Queen Esther are not recorded any further in the Word of God, but further accounts for the greatness of Mordecai. It says in Esther 10 verse 2, were written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. You might notice throughout the Old Testament there's many times that it says that there's records written in the annals of kings. In the books of Kings this is written all the time. If we had those books today, what a different understanding we would have of what was going on in those days. But it seems like none of those books have actually survived. And so we rely on this record. So we're going to continue following the journey of Abia, the descendant that we're looking at, who is a forefather of Jesus the Messiah. And the only way we can do this is by looking through the lens of history. So what was going on at that point in time. And so before we go any further, I'm going to show you a picture which was actually took in 1960. This picture is in a place called Ecbatana, which was the Median capital that I showed you on the map earlier. And this fellow here is actually one of the descendants. He's a Jewish man who lives in Iran today. This fellow is a guard at the tomb, and inside you may notice here, what do you see? The Ten Commandments. And this here, it goes up with a rug and curves and goes back down, and one behind it here with this pinky purple colour, these are actually the two tombs of Esther and Mordecai. And so these are taken care of and looked after to this very day. Okay, so it's quite extraordinary. So once again, it's not just a biblical story. It's very much part of history in Persia, and of course that means in today's Iran. So yeah, so it's quite fascinating. Okay, so now we're going to go back and we're going to start having a look at what was happening during this period of time. Now that we've finished the book of Esther, we mentioned some of this last week, so we're just sort of running over it a little bit and then launching into what happens from there. But basically, the Persian Empire in the book of Daniel is defined as the ram. And it tells us that in the future, that a shaggy goat from the west is going to come very quickly through to the east, and it's going to knock out the ram. Now the shaggy goat in history is Alexander the Great. But of course nothing happens in one day. And so there's a sequence of events that happen along the way. And so we find, last week we were having a look at some battles, and this is the Persian Empire at this point in time. They occupied Thrace, Macedonia here. They were a vassal state but still running independently, and the balance of Greece wasn't. These areas marked in green were actually opponents of Persia. There's many islands amongst them, and they went into conflict against the Persians. Predominantly they're headed up by the Athenians and also by the Spartans in history. Okay, so the rundown is in 479 BC. There was a battle that was called of Patay and Makal, in which Greek cities of Asia Minor, so this is Turkey today, this is the Dardanelles and Constantinople here, but the Greek cities of Asia Minor revolted, and Xerxes was unable to stop them. So these are all the cities around the coast here. So Xerxes focused instead on construction projects and maintenance of the empire's roads when this happened. Whilst he seemed interested in depleting the royal treasury for his projects, history tells us he spent lots and lots of money. This was the king who did what to get lots of money? Part of the way he got money? Right. He melted the gold statue in the plain of Dura that was built during the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. We worked out that it was about $6.5 billion worth of gold. So he had lots of coin to spend, but of course all good spenders run out sooner or later. And he was digging into the royal treasury and going a little bit too hard. So The Greeks, however, were determined to continue their fight against the Persians, and they formed a confederation of city-states called the Delian League, led by Athens. So I'm just going to ask the question, we've spoken about this in the past, what is a city-state? Anyone remember what a city-state is?
It's a country which is contained in a city, which is its own ruler.
Right. And so if I asked you, so it's a country which is a city with its surrounding environment, it's not big. What's a modern day example of a city-state?
Singapore.
Singapore's one.
Monaco.
Any others?
Monaco.
Monaco, perfect.
Italy, the Vatican.
The Vatican is actually one too, correct. So we still have some today, but what it denotes is that instead of where we look at a kingdom as some massive big territory or country, it's actually in fact some tiny, tiny areas. And so countries were made up of many, many kingdoms or kings, but they were somebody who basically occupied a large modern day suburb or perhaps a smaller sized city, if you will. We find that some of the ancient cities, which we look at in history as being really huge, you watch movies with incredibly, many thousands of people in battle, and we find that in reality they could only hold 3,000 to 6,000 people that hold the place. And so the reality is these things were much smaller than what we see today. And so in the Greek land masses and islands, and also all through the Persian Empire, there was many, many city-states all combined together at the end of the day. They're either allied or they would fight against one another. So the result of these circumstances led the king to impose heavy taxes on the people who lived throughout the empire, and apparently this particular king seemed pretty oblivious to the significant strain that he caused. So reflecting on the people who are in the province of Judea, where Abed's living, they and the Jewish people were placed under financial strain like the rest of the empire during this period of rule of this particular king. Okay, so this moves on to new territory now. So between 479 and 469 BC, we find what they call the Pamphylian offensive. So Pamphylia is this region here. You can see Cyprus, you can see Israel over here with Jerusalem. So this is part of modern day Turkey. So the Delian League of Greek allies, they attacked the Persian-controlled territories throughout the Aegean Sea for a full decade. So this is going on and on and on. In 469 BC, the Persians assembled a large army and navy to attack the Greeks near the mouth of a river up here called Eurymedon in the region of Pamphylia. An Athenian general called Cimon, he took 200 triremes. So triremes are warships with three rows, 3 levels of decks with 3 levels of rows, which means more people could row so they could go much faster. And they sailed to a location in Pamphylia close by called Phaselis, which is located here, to join with the army of the Delian League to block the Persian forces. So from Sparta and Athens, over this way, they came across, and you can see all these arrows, they're pushing back these nations, and then they've sailed over to here. So this general Cimon sailed his navy into the mouth of the river, and he routed the Persian navy, and they beached their 200 triremes, so they had 200, and they fled to their army on the land. The Greeks destroyed the boats and attacked the Persians and took victory, so they won this particular battle. So the Greek goat, as we mentioned, of Daniel's vision, as I say, is beginning to nibble the Persian ram. They're starting to have some inroads, some success. And we have to understand that when we talk about this, it may seem very historical, but the reality is not just history in the making, but it's God's plan that's actually unfolding. This is what's going on. Okay. Now, we come to a point in time here where we've been following along with this particular ruler, and this ruler, of course, is getting older and older as each year goes by, like all of us. So in 465 BC, 9 years after Mordecai had saved the Jews throughout the empire, and soon after his defeat by the Greeks in Asia Minor, King Xerxes, the husband of Esther, was actually assassinated by a man called Artabanus, who was the commander of his bodyguard, with the help of a eunuch called Aspamitris. And so we find that he meets his end. So Artabanus was the most powerful official in the Persian court. He was known as Hazarapat, which is a commander of 1,000 soldiers. He rose to prominence and he put his 7 sons into strategic positions and formulated a plan to dethrone the Achaemenids. So he's going to end this dynasty and wrest it from them, or so he thought. So when he assassinated the king, he also killed the crown prince Darius. But when Artaxerxes, the 3rd son of King Xerxes, found out they had been murdered, he then killed this fellow Artabanus and his 7 sons, and he saved the Achaemenids from losing control of the Persian Empire and became the next and the 5th king. And so we move now to this fellow, and what do we have for the first time? We have a minted coin with the head of this fellow, and we won't call it period costume because it's actually what they used to wear. You can see these 2 tassels down the back. Does anyone know what they're called? They're called a, what's a ancient word or a Latin word for 2? Un, deux, trois, French. Want to give me a language? They're called dia, dem. So all ancient rulers would wear these 2 tassels at the back. If you look at many of the rulers as we go through and we show the pictures of them, you'll see they often just wear a little, like a cord, and it has 2 tassels at the back. It's called a diadem. When you go to the book of Revelation, you read about the 7 dragons, the 7 heads. Each of them are wearing a diadem, and the diadem represents a king. Okay, so we're not going to go into that tonight, but this is what a diadem is. So he's got his crown or his helmet on, and this is what he looks like. So he's an ancient Persian man, and so we had a look into his name. Last time we had a look at who Xerxes was, and Xerxes' full name means a brave king who rules over heroes. Well, Artaxerxes has the meaning of righteous ruler, and you see that his full name is Artaxerxes I Macrachir. Now, Macrachir has another word in Latin or Greek, which is actually longimanus, and so we get the word long here, and we get manus, and so we're talking about hands. And so the thing that was unique about him is that this word means long-handed. And so apparently, and they named him after this, his right hand was longer than his left. And so this was, funnily enough, historically recorded, and this is how he's actually remembered into his name. And that's how he can be identified as a different king from a different period to others. And so we put all these titles, the title with the name, it would basically come out that he is a long-handed righteous ruler. So quite an odd name. Now, this particular fellow, if you're wondering who he is or where he came from, he was actually the satrap or the governor or regional king of the province of Bactriana. So Bactriana encompasses portions of today's Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So it's actually on the eastern side of the Persian Empire towards Pakistan and India today. Okay, so that's where he was actually living or ruling from. Okay. Next, so I have a nice picture to help to explain what was going on. So this is all part of what's going on with the Persian Empire, and we find that all of the activity that's coming against it is actually coming from the West. The biblical prophecy that comes from Daniel that talks about his vision, he says that the opposition will come from the West. And so what actually happened was the Egyptians were rebelling against the Persians at the same time that the Greeks were rebelling against the Persians. And so what happened was there was a ruler, and I'll have a look at this in a bit more detail, I'll just show you the map first, who was actually ruling from this place called Maria. He was a Libyan independent king, and he's basically right on the edge of the Nile Delta on the western side is where his palace was, but he ruled this region that's enclosed by the circle. And so he invited the Athenians to come and join with him to go against the Persians. And so these are these triremes. These are actually Greek triremes from this Persian period. That's what they look like. And in fact, these ones down here are actually Persian triremes from the same period of time. So you can actually see what they actually look like. Now what happened was the Greek navy underneath this fellow Charitomedes came down through the Mediterranean, and he came all the way down the Nile Delta through here, through down to this place called Pampremis. The Persians, you might remember in the previous lesson we told about how Darius I dug a canal to access the Nile River, and it came up from the Gulf of Suez. Why? Because they have a lot of land that fronts the oceans at the bottom of the southern end of the continent. And so they would come up through here, and they met in this battle. So I just wanted to put this map up to sort of give you some background to what's actually going on. So I'll just check with my notes. Sorry. So I'll leave that on for a moment. Okay, so what's happening is the son of a prince called Psamtik, his name was Anaros, was a Libyan who ruled his people from this place I mentioned called Maria. Now he drove out apparently the Persian tax collectors and some mercenaries to start a revolt in Egypt soon after the newly coronated Artaxerxes sat on the throne. We mentioned this before. Every time a new king comes in, everybody wants to try and push them back out again, and so they test them. So apparently this rebellion spread rapidly through Egypt. So this king Anaros had allies from Athens who sought to confront the Persian army in any way, and when he appealed to them, they sent 200 ships under the command of Charitomedes in 460 BC. So whilst the navy approached, Achaemenes, who was a brother of the king Artaxerxes, was actually governing Egypt at the time. He assembled a Persian army of 400,000 men and 80 triremes, these warships. When the Athenians arrived, they sailed up the Nile River and joined Anaros with his forces. The Persians were camped nearby when they engaged in battle, and Achaemenes and 100,000 of his men were killed at this location called Pampremis, which I mentioned over here. So this is where the big battle took place. And of 50 Persian triremes, 20 were captured and 30 were sunk by the Greek triremes. The remaining 300,000 Persian soldiers retreated to Memphis, and the dead body of Achaemenes was sent back to his brother King Artaxerxes in Susa. And so these 300,000 people retreated back to this location here at Memphis. So in 456 BC, the Persian general, who I've named over here, his name is Megabyzus, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, was sent down to Egypt, and when he arrived, his army defeated the Egyptians and the Athenians, who had held Memphis under siege. So driven from Memphis, the Athenians retreated to an island in the northern marshes of the Nile, where the Persian general lay siege to them for a year and a half, and eventually they took them all out. And so as a consequence, the Libyan king was also captured and he was taken away. And so that was the end of this Egyptian rebellion at this period of time. This dating brings us to the end of the life of Abiud, who we've got in the genealogy of Jesus. He's the first descendant who was born in the sub-province of Judea during the reign of Persia's King Darius, and he lived under the Persian Empire and didn't know anything else. And so now we are going to move on to his next son, who's called Eliakim. Now in the Bible, these people's names are mentioned, but they don't have an individual story, as we said, and yet all of these events are going on. They're part of the genealogy of Jesus. They're the forefathers of Jesus, which means they all needed to live. They all need to make it through these times. You notice with all these conflicts that are happening, and also during the time of the Babylonians, the Assyrians for a lot of the time, Judea actually sits right in the middle, and yet most of the conflicts happen around them, but not at them. This changes later on in history, of course, but we see that all these things are happening as these different empires jostle for power. And so we're now going to have a quick look at the life of Eliakim and the history that occurs during his lifespan. And as I said, we're going to see the change of rulers from Artaxerxes I, who we just mentioned, through to his son. And I won't tell you all about it, but basically they have a son and they have two other sons who all claim the throne at the same time. And of course, only one will win. And so this is the journey that often happens in history. So in Matthew chapter 1, verse 13, it said, the scripture says, Abiad, the father of Eliakim, which we just put up, he lived in the province of Judea in the 10th year of King Artaxerxes I, and he was the 5th great king or Shah of Persia who ruled over the Persian Empire. Now at this point in time, because we sort of slipped away from the biblical story, you have to remember that the city of Jerusalem is completely built and fortified. The people are settled in the land. There's nothing actually stopping them, but they are obliged to pay taxes. And so as the historical periods go through and the taxes get increased, we know that their life is harder, and they also had to supply men to fight in the armies. And so they were conscripted. So this is the part where you can't escape what happens in the history around them. Okay, so moving on to the next point of history. So I've got most of this as slides, so it's easier to follow. We have what was ended up being called the Peace of Calais. And when we talked about the Greek states earlier on, joining the Delian League led by the Athenians, not all of the Greek states wanted to join them, and they actually led to another faction forming who formed an alliance with Sparta. And so we find that Athens and Sparta, they were often in conflict between each other, and as a consequence of that, the conflict kept them away from going into battle with the Persians. But in 451 BC, a 5-year treaty was agreed to between the two, and the Athenian general Cimon decided that, well, there's nothing going on at home, so I'll go out and we'll go and attack Cyprus. And so he takes 200 of his triremes and he leads an incursion into Cyprus. So they head across here and they split off. 140 of them go to this place called Kition, and 60 of them split off and they go back down to Sais to join with the Egyptians, who are still in the background fighting against the Persians. Now the ruler down here, he was called the King of the Marshes because they were hiding out in these marshy areas of the Nile Delta. There's an independent ruler called Amyrtius from Sais, and he continued to oppose the Persians. So General Cimon first attacked Kition on the southern coast of Cyprus, didn't have enough supplies, so he retreated to this place called Salamis in Cyprus, and of course the Persians came and defeated them, and so they headed back home. They got news, they headed back home, and basically that was the end of that period of time. So that was a body of history, and they agreed to this treaty between the Greeks and the Persians. Okay. Now, during this conflict, King Artaxerxes had decided to weaken the Athenian-led confederation of city-states because they were constantly threatening the Persian interests. So he determined a different way to undermine the Athenians. What can we do if we want to undermine an enemy when another enemy is in conflict with them? How can we bring that to a fruition?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right, and so we help them. And so the Persian emperor decided, well, I'm going to send some funds to the Athenians and they can attack the Spartans, and while they're having their conflicts, that keeps them out of my hair. And so this was his approach. It was successful in the conflict between the factions, caused problems that distracted the Greeks from further aggression against the Persians. Now, during this time, this particular emperor as well, he carried on constructing throughout the Persian Empire, and the effects of this peace and prosperity was also noticed in the province of Judea. So Eliakim, our current descendant, is living in a peaceful time in the region that they actually lived. Now, King Artaxerxes continued to rule over the Persian Empire until he finally died in late 424 BC. So by dating, Eliakim by this stage was 31 years of age. There's no change in history during that time. And King Artaxerxes was succeeded by his son, whose name was Xerxes II. So he's the king. This is his son's name, Xerxes II. But like most kings, he had many concubines. And so he had other sons, but these other sons were classed as illegitimate in terms of becoming heirs to the throne. And so their names were Sogdianus and Ochus. So there's these two other people. So basically one king, one legitimate son, and two illegitimate sons here. Both of them were born, both the illegitimate sons were born in Babylon. Just take notice, we'll flip back and forward here, but there's this region of Hyrcania here, and there's this region which is known as Elam. And so I'm just going to come back and forth as we speak about what happened here. So he was succeeded by his son Xerxes II, and it said he had these two other sons who were illegitimate, Sogdianus and Ochus. So Xerxes was appointed the crown prince of the Persian Empire, but he was only accepted as the king in Persia apparently. So in a three-way tussle, the province of Elam only recognised Sogdianus, whilst Ochus was already governing the province of Hyrcania, which was on that map. He was recognised by the king of Media, Babylonia and Egypt. So if we go back, so here's Hyrcania in this region. It's the northern part of Iran and part of today's Turkmenistan. He was governing this region. This is Elam, along with Babylon and Egypt, were recognising the other. So basically different parts of the Persian Empire were gunning for different sons to rule. So the reign of Xerxes came to an abrupt end after 45 days when he was murdered in Persepolis by the order of his brother Sogdianus. So again, Persepolis is the ceremonial capital, and so they would actually execute people there as well. And so this is where it actually happened. So he only got to rule for 45 days. Sogdianus gained the support of the provinces that he ruled over, only to have his reign cut short after 6 months and 15 days, when he was captured by Ochus and executed in the same ceremonial capital of Persepolis. So the people who lived there must have had a great entertainment, rolling out king after king, and they're all family members and they're all killing one another. So what ends up happening, of course, is that the survivor of the three ends up being this fellow called Ochus. So on the 10th of January in 423 BC, Ochus took the throne and he took the name of Darius II. And so the name Darius obviously was taken from Darius the Great, who is a person of great note in the Bible as a righteous king who helped the Jewish people. And so he took this name for his own. Why? Because he was actually an illegitimate king. And so by taking on this name, he thought that he would make himself legitimate in the eyes of the people. But he saw to it that neither of the names Xerxes or Sogdianus are found recorded on the clay cuneiform tablets that they use, effectively meaning in history that his reign follows sequentially after that of Artaxerxes I. And so they like to wipe out the history of other people. So when we go to museums today and we learn a lot of history, we find that a lot of it's tainted because parts of the story are missing because they want to present a point of view. Now, because Ochus was illegitimate, as I mentioned, he claimed the throne and adopted the glorious name of his earlier predecessor, King Darius the Great, whom we read about in the Bible. Posthumously remembered as King Darius Ochus, he's also remembered as King Darius Nothus, which comes from the Greek word nothos, which means apparently bastard. So in other words, he's a bastard son, he's an illegitimate son. So this is how history records him. Okay. Then after this happened, so we've got a change of three rulers that happened in Persia. We've had the Greeks fighting against the Persians and also the Egyptians, and so once again we have another Egyptian rebellion, and this ends up affecting the Jewish people. So in 411 BC, Amyrtaeus, the grandson of the former Amyrtaeus who we mentioned, who had rebelled against Artaxerxes I, established himself as a rebel against Arsames, who was the eldest son of King Darius II, who he put to rule over the Egypt as the satrap. So we see these kings keep placing their own sons to rule the major powers. He led a guerrilla-style campaign around Sais. So I'm sorry the map's small here, but that's up here in the Nile Delta. In 411 BC, that will become the precursor to the most significant rebellion in the Persian Empire, and that's a rebellion in which the Temple of the Jews, built on Elephantine Island in the middle of the Nile River, will be destroyed, and that is all the way here, right on the border with Kush. Do you remember we talked about this before, how the Jews got there? When did the Jews go there? During the time of? Nebuchadnezzar went after them?
Yeah.
Which prophet was with them? Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Remember Jeremiah went to Egypt to hide, and he got told to go back home again? So they went down here, and there's an island called Elephantine Island, right on the border of Egypt, and they built a temple there, and the temple was a replica of the Temple of Jerusalem to its exact dimensions. And so this temple has survived all the way through to this period of time in history. So we find when we read history that these things that come up in the Bible in the past recur and they come off note again. So in 410 BC, the Egyptian people unexpectedly destroyed the temple of the Jews on Elephantine Island. And this was because the garrison on the same island, so they had a fortress with soldiers there, was actually commanded by a Persian of whom the Jews were vassals, because of course the Persians ruled the empire. So the Jews complained to the commander, and he sided with the Egyptians, but when the news reached Arsames, who was the governor of Egypt, we find that he had the Persian commander removed, and although brought under control, Emertius of Sais would soon step in and control this as his leader. So this fellow who's up here and this rebellion that happened down here, they're all communicating, and this is going to become a force of people for the future. And that brings us basically to the end of the story. So these are the key events that happen during the life of Eliakim. So basically throughout his whole life, so he's there listed in the genealogy of Jesus, his whole story is that he is in peace in Judea, but the Persian Empire is being attacked from the west. So we see the beginning of this vision being fulfilled, the Lord's word given to Daniel, and we see that the Persians are being affected by the Egyptians, both on the west and the Greeks to the northwest on either side. So that's it for tonight. Next week we will continue on with the next descendant, and we will see what history unfolds for the next descendant. Okay, so if you would like to watch this again, as we say each week, you can watch this back on Facebook. You can go to our YouTube channel, type in Paul Brunson, the Jesus Movement, to watch the high definition video with all of the references, and of course our website, thejesusmovement.com.au. So thank you for joining us. Good night, and God bless you.